Chapter 1. Countless Galactic Alliance star cruisers encircled Corvus, one of 3 core worlds and seats of galactic democracy, in a geostationary orbit. Admiral Parker of the Infinite Horizon led the fleet. The Infinite was a massive capital ship. It stretched across 2 miles of space and carried enough firepower to vaporize a city. The atmosphere was tense aboard the Infinite Horizon. The crew slouched in their chairs out of weariness. They had been on 12-hour rotations since they arrived at Corvus. They were all exhausted. Rest was a luxury they could ill afford. "Admiral, we've formed a blockade around Corvus," said Ensign Lee. Admiral Parker's command chair sat in the middle of the Combat Information Center. From there he commanded the entire fleet. His trusted advisors had taken up stations around him. He tasked them with providing real-time battle information, from sensors to shield status. "Give me a status report on the rest of the fleet," commanded Parker. The ensign batted away the notifications that were rapid-firing at her display. She fought to access the communications array. "Half of the fleet has arrived at Jormungandr. The other half is still in transit to Zazura," she responded. "Thank you, Ensign," he replied. "Please open a fleet-wide channel." The ensign tapped a button on her console. "It's open," she replied. The Admiral rose from his command chair. He considered what he was about to say and settled himself before speaking. He reached deep into his diaphragm to project his voice, even though he didn't need to. "Attention all Alliance personnel, this is Admiral Parker. Red alert. I'm ordering continuous scans of the hyperlanes. Trust in the chain of command. Report anything anomalous. We have—" "Admiral," the sensor technician interrupted. "Hyperspace windows detected, multiple sectors. RFID reads Terminus." Alarm rang over the Admiral's face. "Shield!" Boom! A squadron of small starfighters surged through space towards the Infinity Horizon. The leader commanded from the lead fighter. His dark robes and his shiny black helmet obscured his appearance. He approached the Infinity Horizon at breakneck speed. "My Lord Atrox," one of his wingmen spoke over the radio, "we've breached the shield zone of their command ship." "Attack the hangar bays. Destroy anything that tries to leave," Lord Atrox commanded. "Yes, my lord." The other fighters broke off. Atrox pressed on, faster. He reached out with his mind. He felt them. He knew where the command deck was. Atrox adjusted his controls and fired a maximum payload proton torpedo. It lanced through space and impacted the hull on target. A flash of light. The atmosphere whooshed out of the wounded hull and left a vacuum in its wake. Dead bodies were floating in space. Their crystallized forms shattered against one another as he flashed past. Admiral Parker and his command crew were dead. Portals opened in the dark space around the planet, and dozens of frigates emerged. Laser blasts erupted from the Alliance blockade. Terminus ships fired back. Waves of fighter craft, like hordes of insects on the wind, poured out of the hangars on both sides. They met in the void, littering the darkness with tiny specks of light. Countless explosions cascaded through the empty. Atrox sprinted to the rear of the Infinity Horizon. The engine ports pulsed with red energy. "They're trying to escape," Atrox thought. He switched to blasters. His craft's forward cannons erupted. Bolts of light shot into the capital ship's engine ports, leaving holes punched in the metal. Arcs of lightning spewed out of the perforated structures and surged between ports. The engines went dark. He turned his ship and aimed it at the skirmishing fighters. He engaged full throttle. The acceleration pushed his back against his chair. Enemy craft swerved at him, firing impulsive bolts, trying to take him down. He outmaneuvered them. He forced his ship to duck, weave, and roll out of the way. "My turn," he smirked. He reached out again with his mind, this time sensing the fighters around him. His ship was a needle, striking fast and precise. He cleaved fighter after fighter, leaving debris in his wake. He gave no consideration for his enemies, other than that they must die. The Alliance fighters fell back to their cruisers. Heavy cannons lanced out bolts in the void to cover their retreat. "All hands, close and kill," Atrox commanded. "Target their shield generators and engines." Atrox approached the closest Alliance cruiser, sticking close to its massive bulk. He headed toward the engines. Energy bolts from the Terminus frigates collided with the force shields. Energy rippled out from the epicenter before dissipating into nothingness. 3 fighters were on his tail. Laser bolts ripped past his ship. He dodged, panning his ship to the left and 90 degrees before aileron rolling to the right. Still, bolts continued to lance past his cockpit. He looked back and saw an opening. Atrox reversed his thrusters. and the fighters sped past as he decelerated. Blasts erupted from the forward cannons. He vaporized the first fighter, then the second. The third evaded his fire and pulled up, trying to lead him away. Atrox surged forward, ignoring the third fighter. He had to disable the engines. He fired a volley into the engine ports and spun under the cruiser. He engaged full throttle and sped toward the shield generator. There, halfway up the ship, he set his reticle on his target, switched to proton torpedoes and fired. Crash! An enemy fighter intercepted the torpedo. It detonated on impact, and shards of the vessel tumbled into space. Atrox focused his mind as he swung around for another pass. He pictured the generator in his mind. He concentrated his thoughts on making sure his next shot hit. He fired. Bolts of energy hit his ship. It tore through his right-hand wing section, ripping it off the hull and cleaving off one of his engines. His ship spiraled out of control. It tumbled toward Corvus, caught in its gravity. "Ah!" Atrox yowled. Rage was building within him. His mind reached out for the enemy pilot. "There you are!" His mind was consumed with vengeance. He wanted only to crush them within their cockpit, to make it their tomb, and so he did. He raised his hands in front of his chest and held them out as if grasping an invisible sphere. He dug his fingers in and squeezed. The enemy ship buckled, and the pilot panicked, checking her status monitors. The atmospheric seal cracked. Air whistled out, and she gasped for breath. The wings folded in on the fuselage as the nose and tail collapsed in. Atrox closed his hands together, hands twitching with the strain. The enemy pilot was no more. His ship was still hurtling toward Corvus. He focused his attention on its path, visualizing it in his mind. He imagined it flying steady. The ship jolted as he exerted his power over it, slowing the spin. His hands hovered out to his sides as if they were the wings. He pierced the atmosphere. Turbulence. He struggled to maintain control as his ship began its rapid descent. The ground approached, and his ship skimmed through rows of high-rise buildings. Ahead he could see the Senate building. "That's it," he broadcast over the radio. "All forces converge on the Senate building. Our victory today will be the death knell for the Galactic Alliance." It was now or never. Atrox forced open the canopy and leapt from the ship. He used his will to extend his jump before it smashed into the ground. The fuselage screeched as it skidded on the pavement, leaving detritus behind. Alliance soldiers surrounded Atrox. He rolled as he hit the ground. Atrox sprung to his feet and retrieved his heavy blaster pistol from the holster on his waist. Then he unclipped his electroblade and ignited it. The blade unfolded from its handle, extending over a meter in length. Arcs of voltage shimmered along its sides. Laser bolts flew at Atrox from all sides. He used his will to deflect the bolts. Some hit nothing but air, and others smashed into Alliance soldiers. Atrox darted at the nearest enemy, entering close quarters. The other soldiers stopped firing and charged at him in an attempt to engage in the melee. Atrox shot the first one in the gut and threw him into a crowd of others. Soldiers circled them, but Atrox focused only on one victim at a time. He lunged with his electroblade at an open throat. The soldier parried with his baton, striking back at Atrox's head. He ducked and smacked the baton with the side of his blade, knocking the soldier off balance. He swung, and the blade met the soldier's neck. Another soldier swung at Atrox. He parried the blow and then shot him in the face. Sonic booms tore up the sky, causing some soldiers to look up. Atrox didn't. He knew what it was. Terminus had finished with the blockade and was beginning the ground assault. Slice! Atrox seized the moment, decapitating 3 soldiers that looked away. Then he blasted another in the chest. The sound of Terminus fighters closing in echoed through the valley of high-rises. It was a sound of horror to the Alliance. Explosions rang out as the first ships dropped bombs on Alliance troops. One of the bombs fell ahead of Atrox and behind his enemies. He dropped his weapons. The bomb exploded. He exerted his will, stretching his arms out. He was trying to contain the blast. The explosion eviscerated the enemies in front of him. The power was too much. It broke his hold and knocked him several meters back, where he tumbled onto the ground. He struggled to his feet, using his arms to brace himself. His singed, dark cloak flailed in the wind as smoke fluttered from the edges. He staggered forward, making for his weapons. Each step he took was a little easier than the last. He gathered his pistol and blade and looked toward the Senate. The Alliance was in full retreat. Their soldiers had turned their backs on their attackers and ran at full speed for cover. Time to end this, he thought. He pressed on, one step at a time. Each enemy he saw, he shot. He didn't care if they were running away. They dared to challenge him. Now they would pay the price. The Senate courtyard was a mile away. The Alliance soldiers had barricaded themselves in cowering behind makeshift barriers, cobbled together using various debris and detritus. Terminus cruisers hovered over the streets surrounding the Senate building. Laser bolts bounced off their force shields. Ahead of him, smaller cargo craft unloaded squads of Terminus troops. When the transport's rear doors opened, they leapt out and sprinted into no man's land, their crimson armor glinting in the sunlight. Atrox picked up his pace. His arms swung at his sides as he reached a sprint, catching up to the wave of troops heading toward the barricades. A head poked around the barrier. Atrox's pistol barked once. His blaster bolt punched through the soldier's head, and the body collapsed to the ground. "Fire!" came a shout from beyond enemy lines. Atrox deactivated his blade, clipping it back on his belt. Dozens of soldiers were now visible. Blasters fired volleys of bolts, some at him and some at his men. He reached out his left hand and projected a barrier ahead of him. Bolts ricocheted away. They glanced into the air, the ground, and sometimes the men around him. He didn't care. This was his moment. Troops collapsed to his left and right. He pressed on, drawing on his psychic might as he leapt into the air and somersaulted over the barricade. Before he landed, he unclipped his electroblade once more and touched down. He landed next to an enemy soldier. She screamed. Before she could do anything else, Atrox pressed his blade hilt handle up against her abdomen and ignited it. It unfolded through her, ripping a cavity through her spine. He twisted it and cut it out of her belly. Without pause, he lunged at his next victim, cutting them down as well. The sound of armor crashing against durasteel rang out. The Terminus troops reached the barricade. They clambered over it, tumbling to the ground. The enemy dispatched the first wave of troops, yet soon their numbers overwhelmed the defenders. Atrox whirled through his enemies, slicing and blasting with abandon. Then it was over. Though littered with carrion, the courtyard was theirs. "Lord Atrox," came a voice from behind. It carried an air of arrogance. Atrox reckoned it was the kind that only comes with gifted power. "You survived." Atrox turned. Behind him was the most pathetic excuse for an officer he had ever had the displeasure of meeting. The man was tall and thin, a lanky twig in an officer's blazer. His pressed and creased black satin trousers accompanied his polished leather dress shoes. He contained his golden locks under the cover of a black beret. "General Knox," Atrox sighed. "War can be such an inconvenience." Atrox regarded Knox for a moment. "It would seem the Alliance do not have talented marksmen. I do not imagine it would be difficult to pick you from a crowd, even during a battle." "Your recklessness almost cost us this mission," Knox barked, disregarding Atrox's jab. "If it were not for me, we would never have reached the planet," Atrox retorted. "But we can discuss strategy later, General. I have a planet to destroy. Bring me the device."